Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of Libero. I'm Jack Pitt-Brooke from The Athletic. I'm joined today by Rory Smith of The Observer and John Brewin. Now, next week is the return of Champions League football, and I think this is a week which is going to pose us a question that I have been wondering about for the last few months, really. It's a question I want to put to Rory. Rory, are PSG the best team to watch in Europe at the moment? And has that ever been true before?
That's a really good question that obviously I can't answer in a, actually accurate and scientifically reasonable way, because I haven't watched every team in Europe. But
you haven't watched PSG through the entirety of their, 55-year existence?
I remember, I'm going to compare them to the team of Hawaii in 1992. No, I think for in the Champions League this season, after you get past the kind of weird false start that they had of the first 4, maybe 5 games, they have become breathtaking in a way that I'm not sure any other team is. Barcelona maybe at points get to that same that edge of the seat, you are thrilled to watch them. I watched the Barca Borussia Dortmund the first leg of the quarter, and Barcelona in patches in that game were really they looked really good. Lamine is a brilliant player to watch, and Lewandowski's got this kind of authority and calmness in everything he does, and Rafinha is totally transformed and all that stuff. But there's something quite breathtaking about PSG, a combination of excitement and novelty, directness, technical ability, and also youth that makes them maybe the most. Can I kind of sit on the fence and say they're the most compelling team to watch in Europe?
John, do they compel you?
Yeah, definitely. I think Roy hits on most of the strong points there. It's that I think when you think of teams. And listen, Paris Saint-Germain aren't breaking through from anywhere, but they've been around for ages.
Plucky underdogs.
They're not plucky underdogs, but we're seeing a different side of them, and we're seeing a side that attacks with such with pace and youth, and a couple of players that every team in the world would want, and it's not free flowing because it's not totally liberal football, because Luis Enrique is, a coach who is all over the numbers and all over the detail. And it strikes me that they have to work pretty hard to look this liberal and free. That's what happens quite a lot in football, isn't it? Teams look like it's off the cuff, and I'm sure there are moments of being off the cuff, but they're playing brilliant football. And, I was up at Arsenal the other day, and there's a lot of trepidation about playing them, and there should be, because once you come up against that attack, you could be in trouble against those games against Liverpool. People have been talking about the Champions League season being quite disappointing, but those games against Liverpool, that was your classic Champions League stuff, wasn't it? That's what you need. That's what you need. And the thing is okay, so the question was, were they the first time? Well, already mentioned him, didn't he? Haye back in the 90s, brother of Socrates. I remember a game they played against Barcelona in 95. Beat Barcelona, the famous Barcelona, the dream team of that era. And then they had Ronaldinho, and then we went through to Zlatan. They've always been a club of ambition. Obviously, that ambition has been exacerbated by the financing and the involvement in the beIN empire in Qatar and all that type of thing. And then there's the glamour of the club as well. I suppose one of the things about Paris is French football, when we were growing up, who were the big clubs?
Marseille,
Bordeaux,
Lyon.
Teams in the, you get Lens winning the title and stuff like that. And then there was the Lyon model. Remember the Lyon model, where everyone was like, this is the best run club in the world ever, until it wasn't. And then, of course, Paris essentially took over. PSG took over the French market. And again, we could go into a long debate about this, but the fact that the capital city club only formed in 1970 are just arriving at this point. They've had near misses. The Neymar thing in the lockdown. Do we count the lockdown Champions League?
Yeah.
No, non-canon.
Jack says it's non-canon, but
COVID football's non-canon.
I agree with you. I did enjoy the Lyon-Manchester City game, which was the Sterling nightmare. But it was. But
that was the last game of football that had me rolling around on the floor screaming, I think.
Right. Okay. Yeah, well, I watched it outside a pub. We found a pub I've been to with you many times, Jack, and there was a lot of rolling around, screaming done that night. It was lockdown. We were needed to release pressure. But anyway, I was saying that Neymar team, they came so close, didn't they? That was the point where it felt like. And then, of course, what did they do after that? Let's sign Lionel Messi. Yeah,
there is this like thing with PSG that, and we'll come on to this about the artificiality of that Messi, Neymar, and Mbappe project. But with PSG, and I don't mean this in a condemnatory way, but PSG is an inherently artificial construct. As you say, John, it founded in 1970. It has always been. Daniel Hector, who was a fashion designer, designed the badge and the first kit, I think. Like, there has always been this sort of union between Parisian football and Parisian couture, as the French say. Like, it has always been as much a cultural institution. It's always meant to be glamorous. And yet, at the same time, you can't ever allege that it's like a fake club, because
the fans aren't.
Like,
the fans
yeah. It's almost like the fans are supporting the wrong team. Do you know what I mean? Like, you've got this like here's the crowd with Rihanna and David Beckham, and then the fans are all topless with their drums and their flares, and you're like, hang on, you two. This is not an easy kind of fit. I think they've always been PSG. They maybe haven't been, to answer Jack's question, they've probably never been the best team to watch in Europe before, but they've always been a good team to watch in Europe. They're always quite fun, PSG, whether they're good or bad. Like, they're never boring.
I mean, they've had some disasters that have been really. I mean, the Barcelona one obviously is we're talking classic Champions League, La Folie or whatever. It just. I mean, and I suppose this is the question. We're getting to that point in the Champions League season, aren't we? Are they a cursed club? Because this looks like their best chance since the Neymar one, if we count that as a chance, and if we count that as football.
So my impression,
only Jack says it's not counting.
It doesn't count. It doesn't count.
I sort of agree with that. Yeah.
My impression watching this team, and obviously I've watched an extensive 3-4 games of them on TV this season, while also looking at my phone. But that said, my impression is that this is the first time we've seen a PSG team since the Qatar takeover, which I believe is 2011, where I really feel like they are putting their emphasis first and foremost on being a good team. We've had 14 years really where it's all been about who's the most famous player we can sign. Initially it was Zlatan, then it was Beckham, then it was Neymar, then it was Messi, and like every single time they've thought who's the most famous player we can, and then of course you've got Mbappe in there as well, Buffon, Verratti, Lavezzi, Cavani. There's been basically Pastore. There's a whole list of them, but like
basically everyone that was popular on Twitter in 2011.
Like at every single point, they've thought who's the most famous player in the world, and they've gone and got him eventually.
Who did 4-4 Tom like the most?
Exactly.
That was their signing policy. Yeah,
Draxler is part of that as well.
Exactly. It's all there.
But I guess this is, and it didn't really. I mean, it's worked fairly well in the sense that they've won tons of Ligue 1 titles. They've sold millions of shirts. You don't sell those shirts without. I know Rory's right about like the fashion tie-ups and stuff. You also don't sell those shirts without having really exceptionally famous players. But this is the first time. But it's obviously like inhibited them from being a team that looks like a really good team, right? Like a team that is coached by a top European coach that plays football in the way they wanted to play. Like, it was obvious that under Tuchel or Pochettino or whoever, they couldn't play the football the manager wanted them to play. But this is the first time that I've seen them, and I thought, this is really like the cutting edge of football. Like, I've never seen a team with a front three as quick as this. Like, I've never seen, like, we're all used to, teams being really athletic nowadays, but I've never seen anything like Kvaratskhelia, I'm sure Rory will correct me on the pronunciation, Dembele, and then either Doué or Barcola. Like, I've literally never seen anything like that before.
Well, this is a really Wilson point, and he's not here because given how early he was the other day, presumably he's dead now. But I love Kvaratskhelia. I feel as though he is my player. I discovered him. No one else had heard of him before me. He's one of those players that I interviewed him early, and so I kind of feel a totally unwarranted sense of ownership of him, which Jack finds very funny and I think a bit pathetic. But anyway, like I have a big thing about Kvaratskhelia, which is that I think he wasn't. You can kind of tell that he didn't come through like an industrial scale academy. You can tell that he's had a slightly weird route into elite football. So it obviously starts in Georgia, goes and has a few years at Rubin Kazan in Russia, then comes back, has this weird 6 months at Dinamo Batumi, and then goes to Napoli. And there's like a freshness and a rawness to Kvaratskhelia that I think is really appealing. If you look at or even like someone like Lamine, who is a brilliant player, and he does things that take your breath away, but you can tell that he's every rough edge has been polished. Whereas Kvaratskhelia still like he makes weird decisions. He does things that you don't expect, and you don't really see that much in top level European football anymore. Just everyone is trying to talk from the age of 6. This is what you do. Wilson's thing is that may or may not be true, but what's really interesting about Kvaratskhelia is how much he works. So he is this glamorous £70 million signing, superstar in the making, all this stuff. But he tracks back. There is not even a sense of... I think it was during the Liverpool-Leicester game the other day when Salah found himself covering for Conor Bradley at right back and gave away a free kick, and the commentator sort of said, well, Mo Salah doesn't often find himself in that position. And that's kind of true of Salah. He's been a bit better this season, that Salah's he's too big. It's like the superstar equivalent of too posh to push is like he's too big to track back. And whereas Kvaratskhelia he works really hard. And the same is true of Doué and Barcola. And it might be that at some point, 1, 2 or 3 of them decide, actually, do you know what, we're far too famous to be doing this work. But at PSG at the moment, they seem to be in that like sweet spot where they have like young, talented, hungry players who are doing, like Jack says, like they're quick and they're exciting and they're kind of inventive going forward. But they all work, and that I think is the big difference. Just PSG did try and win the European Cup for several years with 8 players defending, and that was it. The front 3 just didn't bother.
So it's their first ever, in that sense, it's their first ever starless team. Like, I guess the only obviously Marquinhos has been there forever. Donnarumma's a big star. Dembele has cost huge amounts of money before, but they're not. They've got no players there who are above doing the work, and that is the difference, right? Because ever since they signed Zlatan from Milan in 2012, I think, they've always had a category of player who was kind of elevated above all the rest of the players, right? Like they've always had, and this is one of the reasons I know that, when Pochettino was there, one of the things that he ran into was like, how do you build a sense of buy-in out of a squad where some of the players literally earn 10 times what the other players earn? You can't build a unified squad with no hierarchy in that kind of environment. And this, I think, it feels to me like the first time they've really had, they haven't had anybody who's weighing down the team with their wealth, with their ego, fame, all the other stuff that comes along with having the most famous players in the world.
It's an interesting thing, French football, isn't it? In terms of European competitions, they really haven't won as much as they should have done. In terms of the talent that French football turns out, and in fact, that French football takes across the world, if you think of Africa and places like that. You think of, Arsene Wenger had that unfortunate record, didn't he? He'd lost in every one of the major finals as a manager. I remember Werder Bremen beating Monaco back in between 91, 92.
Nobody remembers Werder Bremen beating Monaco in anything.
Yeah, but it's
not possible to remember that.
It did happen, and it was one of those I used to follow French football quite a bit in those days. And of course you had the Marseille team, who did win the European Cup.
Yeah, why don't we talk about that very much? It never comes up. People don't seem to want to discuss it.
Well, there was a bribery scandal, Rory, which actually I don't think they were ever disbarred from winning the European Cup, but it certainly overshadowed that. Well,
they had a French title. They were stripped of a French title, weren't they?
Yes, they were, yeah.
The French title that season doesn't count, but the European Cup still does. I maintain when Libero becomes a major media platform that our first serial podcast should be on that Marseille team.
Absolutely amazing.
Because it's a really weirdly undertold story. European football's darkest hour
as well.
Yeah, but if you look at the end, this is ruining Jack's running order. But if you look at the NFL or the NBA, they curate their history really well, and they're helped by things like ESPN, who produce all those amazing documentaries.
Absolutely, yeah.
Say is European football's darkest hour, like this shamed team winning the biggest trophy on offer. That's an inherently compelling story. I'm really surprised that in the golden era of podcasts, nobody has thought, I'll just do six quick episodes on Marseille. It wouldn't even be that expensive to produce, to be honest.
Bernard Tapie is no longer with us, of course, so
you can say what you like.
But libel does matter often in these matters, and there's a lot of hair-raising stories there. But actually, that club, also, you think of the talent that went through that club. Chris Waddle, who I believe was compared to our Georgian wizard the other day.
Yeah.
Which I don't see that one myself.
No, not at all.
No, I think Chris Waddle is a bit more like Cole Palmer, but there you go.
Do you think we could get a full hour of content out of who is Chris Waddle most like in modern football?
Chris Waddle? I'm sure we could, But I was going to say, that French football had this, the Marseille era probably, cast a great big shadow over things. But Paris PSG did have that era, didn't they, in the 90s? They were a glamour club then. They really were. I mean, you had David Ginola. I mean, he left them for Newcastle, so things can't have been that well paid. But
Ali Benabia?
Yeah.
Deep cut.
What's funny about Ali Benabia, Rory? He's a
Ali
great player.
Benabia was a brilliant
Ali
player.
Benabia.
He's a better player than any of the players you bang on about.
Was he better than King Clancy? That's the question.
I think the
might
thing
have been.
with
Not
France,
at City, but maybe overall.
Yeah.
the thing with France has always been that it's a place that players come from, isn't it? That's always been the issue. That like Papin was in that Marseille team but went to Milan, and other than maybe those few years of Tapi's Marseille, it's never had a club that's a destination. So Platini left for Juventus, and I think that's probably held back those kind of honours in European football for quite a long time. That it's a place that
it's not
other people go and get players.
PSG have sort of become the Bayern of. Because Bayern actually were a sort of late developing club in German terms as well. Around the time of the Bundesliga, they were, they developed from that point, didn't they? They appeared in that era, whereas your Schalkes and Nurembergs were the historic clubs. PSG aren't by nature of being formed in 1970, but then became that club, that glamour club, and pursued the Parisian thing, and obviously. In France, there is that divide, just as there is in England, between London and the rest of the country, between Paris and the rest of the country. And, there are other Parisian clubs that have attempted this. I'm not talking about, the communist L'Étoile Rouge, Red Star, but you had Racing Club, which was in the 80s. I think they attempted a rebrand, didn't they? And I think they had Enzo Francescoli played there, I think a young Ginola. But that for whatever reason, that didn't come off. And then Paris was the one. And we've also got Paris FC at the moment, who are in Ligue 2, I think. And they're owned by the richest guy in France, the guy that owns just about every luxury brand that you can get. Paris leans on being Paris quite a lot, doesn't it?
You've seen that with PSG as well, that they've, Man United, obviously, in 99 or whatever, pull football club off the badge and everyone gets really upset. PSG is, in terms of your box score, like the box score for Paris Saint-Germain on TV screens should be PSG. It always was. It was for years and years and years, but now it's PAR. The badge is much more Paris. Like the Paris bit is in much bigger font than Saint-Germain. They're not that bothered about the Saint-Germain bit. They want... I think if they could, they'd probably rebrand as Paris FC. They can't, as you say, just that's taken. And there has been a concerted effort within the club, I think, in the last 10 years. That's partly why they wanted it, I think, the Qataris, that Paris is an amazing brand internationally. And if you look at the work they've done as a brand in the last 10 years, since the takeover, like PSG are an insane success story. We talked a little bit about this before, that they've had tie-ups with Air Jordan, they do all these special shirts, there's loads of... Like, they kind of pioneered the footballers' streetwear thing. They bring out special edition shirts constantly. The one this year is dark blue.
There's a shop on Oxford Street.
There's a shop on Oxford Street.
That sells PSG. I mean,
which presumably is aimed at like American and Far Eastern tourists who are coming to Europe and might have not got their PSG thing in Paris, so they can get it in London on their trip.
If I can briefly push back on that, like I think lots of English kids love PSG.
Yeah,
maybe not so much right now. But as of 2-3 years ago, if you go down any park in London, you see so many 8-year-olds whether it's Neymar, Messi, or Mbappe is almost besides the point. The point is they've all got PSG shirts. They've got 3 brilliant PSG players to pick from.
As the proud owner of a 7-year-old who owns, I think Ed's got 4 PSG shirts, which is just my sister lives right outside the Parc des Princes, so presents tend to be PSG themed. When we at his training sessions on Saturdays, we've got 50-60 kids, there'll always be 4 or 5 PSG shirts because they all have them. As you say, it's proof of the power of Messi, Neymar, and Mbappe. From a business point of view, signing those 3 players worked enormously. And there was this. We've probably had this conversation privately before, but for a long time there was this kind of debate about whether the PSG model was kind of a laughable imitation of what City were doing. The City were winning all these trophies, and they like this incredibly smoothly run club. And that's true. Like on the pitch, PSG's success doesn't really match City's, to be honest. But off it, I think PSG have probably beaten pretty much anybody. Like their profile is up there with Real Madrid and Manchester United and Barcelona. They are an enormously successful brand, and that was central to their plan as well.
Yeah, I know at least one teenager in Macclesfield who wears a PSG shirt. It's my nephew, and it's interesting to think of it. PSG, and I bet there'll be actual City fans in Macclesfield as well. But it's what's the cooler club? Sorry, Jack, it is PSG. They do have that Parisian, despite the fraternisation with the Gallaghers and all that, and getting Johnny Marr sat with Mike Pickering. It's, Kravitz and Wycliffe Jean and all these types that they're really selling Paris across America as well. That's the other thing as well. It's a market you work in, Rory, and they've made that big break, haven't they? That sort of cultural thing. That's
well. The thing is,
I don't want to sound like I'm defending the City owners, but I think that if I may do so for a minute, what I would say is that I always feel like City's route to sports washing has been, let's build the best team possible. And how do you build the best team possible? You get the best executives who bring in their mate, who's the best manager. You give him as much money as he wants, basically money, no object, and he can build a super efficient team. And we don't need superstars because we'll get good players if they're good and they work for us, but we don't need to go out of our way to get an especially famous player because we're just here to be a functional team. City are unbelievably functional. And it's only really been in the last sort of 3 or 4 years since they started shopping at the top end of the market, like Haaland, Grealish and so on. I don't believe with a lot of success, but it's been a kind of new policy. Whereas at PSG, they've done things the other way around. They've obviously gone players first, managers first. Then if we turn into a good team, great. If we don't turn into a good team, then no. So I think that but even though the team that they produced hasn't been as good as the teams that Manchester City produced, obviously, the byproduct, it's not even a byproduct, it's the kind of intended consequence of having all those famous players, as well as the other kind of brand associations or whatever you want to call it, of being PSG and being in Paris, means that they just have a kind of allure and glamour to the world that I think Manchester City haven't been aiming for. I don't think Manchester City have at any point been aiming for, let's sign the most famous players in the world. It's just not been their strategy.
I've always kind of thought that City have kind of fundamentally misunderstood on some level how football works, which is that if you build the best team and win everything, everyone hates you. That's kind of way.
Yeah, that's the thing. I've always thought that. It's why doesn't everyone like us winning everything? It's but you spent the entire 90s hating Manchester United for winning everything.
Yeah.
It's where's the logic in that? What I was going to say, actually, if we talk about PSG as a club, and maybe referring back to Manchester United and Manchester City, does PSG represent Paris?
I do wonder whether we've maybe misunderstood the PSG project a little bit, in that we've judged it by the standards of City or the standards of the Premier League, whereas it may well be that the owners looked at it and thought, look, there's obviously a soft power play here with connected to beIN and the World Cup and all that stuff and Sarkozy, but they looked at it and thought, look, actually our trajectory here is we are going to build a brand. We're going to build an incredibly famous team, one that gets a lot of attention, that gets our name known. We can probably take a reasonably solid guess that will lead to a certain number of French titles, but it will definitely lead to quite a lot of appearances in the Champions League. And that's all we really need initially. I do wonder whether, for City, and that City's, it's just because it's the best parallel, but for City, as for Chelsea before them under Abramovich, winning the Champions League became this huge object. That's what everything, certainly with Chelsea, everything was targeted at the Champions League.
You had to emulate Manchester United and Liverpool, who were the two clubs. It's to get to that, you have to get to that level if you're going to, you've got to go for broke, haven't you? That's what they did,
Whereas with PSG, I do wonder whether for a while, and it's probably not been true for 5 or 6 years, but for a while I do wonder whether they were just thinking, well, we just want to be in the Champions League. We just
want to do what Lyon did and went out in the quarterfinals every year.
But for their purposes, it may well be that there is a kind of almost subliminal difference in what success is in Europe for French teams and English teams. But I think for their purposes, which were to a large extent like brand building and then kind of nation building, few quarterfinals is fine, to be honest. You're involved. People are buying your shirts. Loads of random 8-year-olds in Yorkshire are wearing PSG kits. That's the win.
So there's been a lot of talk about the extent to which PSG is either, depending on your mileage, like an artificial invented football club that was, as old as Alan Shearer, or it's a kind of, authentic representation of the values of the city of Paris and Greater Paris. And I mean, Rory, you got some thoughts on this. What are your big thoughts on this difficult question?
Yeah, so I think in many ways PSG are the perfect encapsulation of what Paris is, which is that it's very glamorous and it ignores the vast majority of its reality because it's not glamorous enough. That seems to be how PSG kind of reflect Paris back to itself. There was a deliberate, like quite stark change in policy at the club around the time they worked out Messi, Neymar, and Mbappe was not like a good thing. There was a deliberate switch to, right, we want to be more Parisian. We want to be more kind of autochthonous. We want to be a little bit more kind of authentically Parisian. We are going to kind of lean into that. And I think the club has always been conscious that Paris is probably, apart from Sao Paulo, the place that produces the most footballers in the world, and yet very few of them play for PSG. And there was this desire to be a little bit more, and there are reasons for that. Having done that like cliched piece from the suburbs of Paris about this kind of incredibly fertile football territory, there are legitimate like structural reasons for why Parisian players play for other clubs and then go elsewhere.
It's kind of weird that Paul Pogba never played for them, right?
And there's loads, like Mahrez is from the suburbs of Paris. And Kante was from the suburbs of Paris. Like, there's a whole generation. The way, very briefly, the way it was explained to me is that you have every other French club is pouring through the suburbs, through the banlieue, looking for talent. So PSG are, although
if you go to the banlieues, the only thing you'll see more of than British football journalists researching features would be football scouts.
Yeah,
I think you'd probably see 3 scouts for every 2 British broadsheet football journalists.
Well, it's actually you mentioned Alan Shearer, but remember Alan Shearer and Neil Maddison were both northeastern lads that ended up at Southampton. So there was at that point of the Wallsend Boys Club and all that stuff. Like every first division club or club across the country would have a scout in that area, as they did on Merseyside, until they made things a little more. Clubs in England have to stick around the locale, don't they? I mean, you're only allowed to live within 50 miles, I think, is the law. Clearly, the system in France seems to be a little bit different because they obviously had this, Clairefontaine, Thierry Henry, and all this stuff. It is Clairefontaine, isn't it?
Clairefontaine, yeah.
Yeah, it's this again. Reflecting back onto England, Clairefontaine's one of those things that St George's Park wants to be, and possibly is by now, but
probably is by now. But yeah, well, I think the Clairefontaine and the kind of centralisation of talent confused it. You have this intense competition with all the other clubs, and Nantes and Lorient will have scouts or whatever.
Absolutely, yeah.
Increasingly, English clubs have scouts there too. They don't want to they don't want to pay the French clubs to be middlemen. They want to get the kids straight out of France. And PSG,
of course, because with Brexit, they have to put them in.
Brexit's made it both easier and harder in various different ways. And then PSG, obviously, it's just one club competing with everybody else. They've only got a limited number of spaces, and because of the sheer volume of kids in those clubs in the banlieue, then PSG will miss some. But I think it is something the club have felt quite keenly, like they're not doing well enough. So they embarked on this big kind of bid to re-Frenchify the team and make it feel more Parisian. And the centrepiece of that was obviously signing Randall Kolo Muani, who was, a Parisian kid who went to Germany to build his career and then comes back for 100 million euros or whatever. That didn't work out, so he's now on loan at Juventus. And I think if you go through the team, apart from like Warren Zaire-Emery, no one's Parisian. So I think you can make the case that it's definitely Frencher than it was before, but it's no more Parisian. And the idea that it's more Parisian is probably, I think all of it is quite cynical because it's solving problems with money, isn't it? It's all saying, it's a curated and acquired authenticity. Whatever you do, PSG are acquiring it. So Doué wasn't cheap. Barcola wasn't cheap. Dembele wasn't cheap. These are all expensive signings, and all right, they're French, and PSG are a French club, and that's great. But there's something inherently cynical about. It feels like a marketing ploy to an extent. It just works better on the pitch.
That's such a Miguel argument.
I was going to say.
I feel like I'm listening to Miguel here.
You've spent too long.
I mean,
and that illustrates another thing.
I'm Miguel pilled. I'm totally Miguel pilled.
No, it is. I mean, but it's hard. But I suppose what you can say is that even if it is kind of deliberate and acquired, it is more effective, and it does at last kind of dovetail with what the coach wants. And maybe the argument is that the most significant figure at PSG now, the difference is the most significant figure is not Kylian Mbappe or Neymar or Messi. It's Luis Enrique. He's the kind of, it's his idea of what football. They look like a Luis Enrique team.
Yes,
because he's the most important person. That, well, as you say about Parish, like the manager's never been empowered to make that the case.
Yeah,
but,
I mean,
like, for example, in the Poch
Emery,
era,
Tuchel, all of them just had that problem, didn't they? Was it Emery arrived from Sevilla, this alchemist of a manager, which he still is in his own way, arrives and, this group of, Cavani and Ibrahimovic say, pressing? Yeah, I won't be doing that, old boy. And that's the end of that, isn't it?
And in the Pochettino era, like, he used to, and I'm sure he would have run into many of the similar problems as Emery and Tuchel, but probably worse, right? Because Pochettino showed up in January 2021, which was when Messi was just about to get there. They already obviously had Neymar and Mbappe at this point, and they'd had Neymar and Mbappe for 3.5 years, I think, by this point, which had obviously dominated the entire Tuchel era. But I'm sure that what those managers will have found is that ideally in a front three, you want the theory at least is that the good qualities of one player multiply the good qualities of the others. Like Mane, Firmino and Salah made each other better because they were all good at different things. Whereas the amazing, like the kind of anti-chemistry of Neymar, Messi and Mbappe is that they all made each other worse. Like these were all brilliant players in their own right who could have been the best player on like a fairly good team, and yet they were all bad because they were all playing together. It was literally the opposite of what, how a football team is meant to operate in that way, right? Because none of those players were used to playing with other players. Let me start that sentence again. None of those players were used to like sharing the stuff they didn't want to share. Like they didn't want to share like who was on the front page of L'Equipe. They didn't want to share who got to take penalties or free kicks. They didn't want to share who got the ball in the best spaces. Messi didn't want to share like playing as a number 10. Neymar and Mbappe didn't want to share cutting in from the left. And I think this now, when I watch the team in its current form, I think finally they've got a combination of players who bring the best out of each other.
Well, yeah, because you look at
the worst,
the way that front three operates at its best, and Kvaratskhelia will be on the left for a bit, then on the right, then through the middle, and Doué will do a bit as a number 10, then a bit as a kind of as a wide right kind of proper winner, then a bit as an inverted winner on the left, and Dembele's moving around everywhere, and they seem to. That's a really good way of framing it, I think. Like they share the bits in a way that you always got the sense that Neymar, Messi, and Mbappe were scrapping to protect their part of the kind of the pie. You get the sense that the 3 or 4 who play up front now are willing to say, well, I'll do this bit while you do that bit, and then we can switch around. And how long it'll last, I don't know. Because the thing is, I don't think it's something to do with like Messi or Neymar or Mbappe's rotten character. I don't think that's true of any of them. I think it's when you get to a certain height, a certain kind of level of fame, you probably change in some way, and your belief about what you should have to do changes.
Totally.
Just to finish, I suppose, in the case of Neymar and Mbappe, Messi's done all right in his career. We can say that
he's fine.
Yeah,
he's
we
fine.
Can say it's like almost the decadence of PSG as a project has ruined their careers. Like they've not hit the heights that they should have done. Neymar isn't as good a player as he should have been had he moved from Barcelona to a club where he was his own man. And as for Mbappe, how many years did he waste there? 3 more years than he should have done? Yeah.
He was there for 7 years in the end, right? From 2017
and it feels
to
like he passed his peak while he was there. Like
he did. Yeah. He should have left he nearly left in 2021, I believe. Was it 2022?
One of the two.
But at that point, when he wanted to leave, he had, PSG had Macron and Sarkozy putting pressure on him to sign a new contract, which I think goes to show that like it's difficult to remove these things from a football, these questions from an entirely football viewpoint. Although equally, again, like to bring out my Manchester City bias here, if he'd gone to Manchester City, it would have only been about football, really. Like he would have had to be, he would have had to be a functional part in a Guardiola team, which, whatever you might think about them morally, like only they are put together to win football matches.
Do you think Mbappe would do that?
I don't know. I don't know enough about what motivates him. I think that the fact that he stayed as long as he did at PSG, when he had nothing more to prove and he had much more to lose than to gain by staying at PSG for as long as he did. And I think the fact that he did does tell us something maybe not incredibly flattering about his motivations, I think.
That makes sense.
What do you think about Mbappe's motivations?
Yeah, I
Hard
don't know.
to read.
He's an almost like studiously blank canvas, isn't he? Like there's clearly there's a polished deliberateness to kind of his public facing character in the same way as there was with Neymar for a while. That is very clearly a marketing thing.
There's a sort of Tiger Woodsy quality to it.
Yeah, that's a good shout.
Of like you're bred to be this sort of ultimate sport Billy guy, but that doesn't make you a rounded human being. Not to say that everyone's a rounded human being, but to cope with those type of pressures in the style that say Messi has done in his own way, Ronaldo's dealt with it in a totally different way. But yeah, there's that sort of sense that it's just been pushed and pushed and pushed into those situations. There's stuff with his mother as well. There's all types of complications there. And it's a sad story because, when we think of Mbappe at the 2018 World Cup, sensational, unbelievable. Football at its best. And it's never quite hit those heights since, has it?
I don't think anybody needs to talk about French football any more than we already have done there. So after the break, we'll be back talking about a different hotbed of talented footballers in Europe, moving from the banlieues to South London.
So, welcome back to episode 11 of Libero. I'm here, of course, with Jack Pitt-Brooke of The Athletic and Rory Smith of something called The Observer. This new hot-thrusting, red-hot publication that I wrote for last week. But there you go. That's a topic for another day.
Different podcast.
Different podcast, yeah. Our media special edition is coming up in a few weeks. Anyway, interesting email here from Ben Charnley, who said he's enjoying the pod. Thanks for that.
Good start.
It's a great start to any email. He says he's a Liverpool fan, which, okay. I'm a Liverpool fan and have no bias towards him, he says, because he wants to talk about the amazing work being done at Crystal Palace, who are in the FA Cup semi-finals this weekend, of course. And he said they were able to make regarding the manager. He said he believed the appointment of Roy Hodgson to be a poor choice, but it turned out to be a good one. Well, okay, but he said following that tremendous selection of Oliver Glasner and then managed to keep him despite the advances of Bayern Munich. And he said also their work in the transfer market has been admirable. Gone the days of signing Mamadou Sakho and Christian Benteke, both Liverpool legends of a sort. But in come the more considered signs of Lacroix, Sarr, Eddie Nketiah has not yet happened, but, we'll see. And then, this group of signings is pretty decent. Adam Wharton, Eberechi Eze, Michael Olise, Roman Ase, Ismail Assar, and Daniel Munoz. I think it's worth highlighting the excellent work done at Selhurst Park. Now, that's true, and Crystal Palace are not the most glamorous team in English football, it's fair to say. Though my first memory of Crystal Palace was I went to the FA Cup final of 1990 and was on the train there. A girl on the train next to me said, what are you doing? So we're off to the FA Cup. And she said, I like the idea of Crystal Palace. It's a nice name.
It is a nice name.
It is a nice name, isn't it? Now, anyone not acquainted with London will also know that Crystal Palace is miles from everywhere. May not actually be in South London. It's in Croydon.
South Greater London.
South Greater
Not that anybody
London.
would say that, but it's not really South London. Like South London, there's a point where South London ends, and it's north of Selhurst Park.
Yeah,
for me.
Many years ago, I had a failed interview for the Croydon Advertiser, with which I didn't realise Croydon was such a big deal. Did apply for city status, and you've got those big areas like Sutton. In fact, let's call Croydon the New Jersey of London.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
It's that sort of. And
is it the Salford of London? No. What's the Salford of London?
Salford is. I mean, you don't admire it, but
Salford's the Brooklyn of Manchester.
My sense with Salford is just give up, lads. Just give up.
But that's the last place anyone's ever going to give up on anything.
I know, but just you've lost. That's my view of Salford.
No, this won't happen. Anyway, we digress. But anyway,
back to Glasner.
Back to Oliver Glasner, a fine manager of a club that I've spent quite a lot of time down at Selhurst, the Coliseum, as certain journalists of the Palace Invasion call it. An interesting stadium. Plans afoot for it to be rebuilt. And the thing is about Crystal Palace is I've been in the Premier League now since I think 2012, 13. Every season before that, every Premier League season before that, they got relegated. So this is the golden era of Crystal Palace. The former team of the 80s who got relegated in, I think, 1980. It's one of those clubs with quite a lurid history, but it's now a very solid club, and it's something we've talked about before, isn't it? About a London club being established, having the wherewithal to survive and become that middle class.
They're kind of the mid-tablist club, Palace, aren't they?
Now, yes.
They are now, and it is, like you say, this is probably, maybe almost certainly the best period in their history. The late 70s may be more exciting. My first memory of Palace is from that same season as that cup final, John, but as a fan of a different persuasion, I remember the semi-final, and to be honest, I've kind of hated Crystal Palace ever since.
That was one of the greatest games of all time.
It was one of the greatest games of all time. It was not a very fun experience.
It was the end of the Liverpool Empire. So we have that
was the game that brought it down. I think Palace are interesting because there's one thing that football does really badly is comparative success. I think football's really bad at gauging comparative success, and generally, so this sounds really kind of Americanophile. It's not meant to, but like in US sport, like you can have a successful season in quite a lot of different ways. You can make the playoffs, you can win the pennant, you can kind of get to various stages in the playoffs, and that be kind of good.
One of your players get the most rushing yards or something like that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you can. Do you know what? You can just have a winning season. You can have a season where the first column is bigger than the second column, and people are like, well, that's a winning season, so that's good. Like if you're a Jets fan, that's dreamland.
Of course.
Whereas in football, generally, I think if it doesn't end with a trophy or something that is a recognised like substitute for a trophy, such as finishing between second and fourth, then it's seen as like par or not quite par. And I think genuinely it's a fail. It's a real failing in the way that football's covered and discussed and kind of thought about by the media in particular, but by fans in general probably, that we can't say, well, actually they've done well because of like that for them is good. So for Palace to be in the Premier League for 10, 12 years, I think is an achievement that doesn't get enough respect. I think part of the reason it doesn't get that much respect is because they're a club that feel like they don't have a thing. So Brighton and Brentford, and to an extent now Bournemouth, all have things and they stand for something. Whereas I think with Palace, although they've toyed with it recently in that kind of Elise Eze, like we're the team that gives Wharton, like give these Championship players a chance to shine in the Premier League. I think for a long time it has felt from the outside as though they are just sort of treading water trying to survive, which while it's admirable is not easy to, from a journalist point of view, to like cover. And I think that might be part of the issue.
There is a thing about Crystal Palace that they represent sort of two sides of that South London life. One of them is, and it's, we all sit here as white middle class journalists, is a very black team, and they represent that South London is an area which is a very full of West Indian and African population, and it's and they have that listen, even when they have this style of play, and it's one of those things I found very difficult to write because I am a white middle class male, but even when Roy Hodgson was there, they had this sort of swing to them, almost like a West Indian cricket team or something. This when it was Eze, when it was Olise, and Mateta, and Wilf Sahar was still around at that time, just throwing stuff around. Sometimes there were some games where they're so on it, and they were the best team to watch in the Premier League, the style that they played in. And it's really off-the-cuff football. It was fantastic to watch. And then the other thing is, they also have a bit of a South London geezer thing to them as well, don't they? Because you have the fans, the Homestale crew that I once spent a train back from Nottingham with. Great lads, actually. Really enjoyed themselves. Invited me to a rave at the end of it. Sorry I didn't come.
Where was the rave?
It's down in Croydon somewhere. I wasn't going there. And then
long way back home.
And then also, they are the club of Alan Pardew, and also the chairman, Steve Parish. Now,
I thought you were going to say they are the club of Ron Nodes.
Well,
I thought we're heading for a Ron Nodes special. Or is that going to be next week?
That's a very different South London. But we can let's not go there. I was going to say that one of the things that used to amuse me is that when you walk into Palace, it's very sort of, there's the car park, and you see the yellow Porsche Carrera, and that doesn't belong to Alan Pardew. That belongs to the chairman, And there is that sort of flash, sort of South London geezer part to it, and the club does encapsulate that sort of mix of cultural mix that's down there, and it's one of the things I like most about the club. It's raw.
True to its area.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and
it's not just like it's not. I mean, so many football clubs nowadays, John, as you know, are like they could exist anywhere, and they just happen to exist on the edge of whatever industrial park you're on, right? Yeah. Whereas this is a club who, for all the reasons that you've mentioned, playing players, fans, right up to ownership. They must be the last. I mean, obviously, I know Stu Parish doesn't own 100% of the club. But I guess along with Tottenham Hotspur, given that Daniel Levy grew up as a Spurs fan, Joe Lewis, I don't know if he's a football fan, but he's at least from East London. Palace and Tottenham are probably the last two, the two of the last like locally owned clubs.
Well, West Ham as well, actually. If you think David Sullivan.
Yeah, true. So I guess those are the three where the owner, or at least like a big, the sort of public face of the ownership, which obviously Levy is and Parish is, in the case of Palace, are local.
Tom is pointing out, of course, Tony Bloom at Brighton.
Tony Bloom at Brighton, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean,
I think Parish is actually from South East London, isn't he? And Parish. Sorry, this is how important is this? Maybe not that important. But Parish is like a really interesting Premier League figure, right? Because
absolutely,
because so many of the Premier League owners or chairmen they don't want a public profile. They just want to show up and vote, do the politics, vote, and go, get driven home in their big black Mercedes van. Whereas I think that like Parish is a very vocal presence, I think, on Premier League matters. He seems to me, and I don't cover this stuff in as much detail as some, but it seems to me like Parish is he's basically like a sort of vocal spokesman for the clubs outside the rich 6, 7, 8, whatever you want to say. Is that
Parish
fair?
He's done a brilliant job, Steve Parish, projecting himself through judicious use of the media. And I've spoken to Steve Parish a couple of times. Like, he will take your calls if you WhatsApp him and explain kind of what you're reporting on. And sometimes he'll say, "I don't want to be quoted," but he'll give you a bit of context and stuff. He's a nice fella. But through judicious use of the media, Steve Parish has cast himself as the voice of the common man, in the sense that like now what Steve Parish thinks, and what Steve Parish thinks generally is what is best for Crystal Palace, is quite often presented in the media as being the kind of the right thing for football.
Conscience, yeah.
Despite the fact that to the 72 clubs in the EFL, what Crystal Palace want is the absolute oppression of the vast majority of football in this country. Like, Crystal Palace are the evil overlords to the EFL, but we think there's so much of that kind of debate, that political debate over what direction football should take is kind of the Big Six, although that's now an outdated concept. Miguel will explain why. The Big Six, don't know what that was, sorry. The Big Six against everybody else. Quite often the everybody else is represented by Steve Parish or by Palace. I think that gives them an unusual like political profile, Palace, rather than they might not get the coverage they want, but they actually have quite a lot of power, Crystal Palace, because of the way Parish has kind of positioned himself successfully, if not entirely intellectually honestly.
Well, talking about public profile of Steve Parish, I thought it was interesting that the Millwall Palace game, when Mateta was on the a receiving end of that horrific challenge, they got Steve Parish did a half-time interview in which the interviewer's trying to get him to talk about how bright things are going with Oliver Glasner and blah blah blah, and he just was like, I can't talk about everything about that challenge. Absolutely just hammered into it, which I thought was amazing. And he is proper heart on his sleeve chairman, doing his best for the club. I can't speak to how good his relationship is with fans. I suspect it, like all clubs, it's up and down. And one of the things about Palace is they are looking to progress. And as we've seen with other clubs, there are painful conversations probably to come over ticket prices and all the rest of things. But at the moment, as Jack said, actually, it retains that authenticity to the club at the moment. But we'll have to see how those things go. And there's obviously this power struggle with John Textor, who is the owner, who appears to somehow got himself into a position where he owns most of the club but has very little power at the club. I don't think he'll be making that mistake again. And it's an interesting club, and as the email said, it's not one that's talked about. We could talk about Oliver Glasner, of course, or you'll know a fair bit about him. But there's a guy from my point of view, 3-4-3, the Ruben Amorim formation. Oliver Glasner seems to have got this to work. How's he done that?
Yeah, it's amazing that Oliver Glasner...
Can I just jump in on Glasner? It's worth remembering that just before, it was only like January of last year, so halfway through last season, where they were clearly going on, the Roy thing had clearly gone on for too long. There were huge they felt huge, but there were significant fan protests against Parish, and lots of anti-Parish banner, Parish and Co, time to go, no shared vision, no structured plan, Parish out, Yanks out, all this stuff. And then all of a sudden you get one good manager in, and it's a pretty slow start I think he had, and then slow again at the start of this season, but now they're flying, and all of a sudden a good manager can make an owner look like a model owner.
Yes.
Who didn't look like one when the manager was bad.
Great
but
point,
that
Jack,
doesn't undermine. I think that just that doesn't undermine what Glasner's done. That actually I think proves it. That proves that for what I don't know exactly how he's done it. Don't actually cover Palace in as much detail as some, but it strikes me that he has found the balance. He's found the right balance out of the players, even with not a huge amount of money to throw around. Right?
They're quite streaky, Palace, aren't they? They just love it in April and May. Just brilliant at football in April and May. Rest of the season, not that fussed, to be honest. I think it's interesting though, because for Palace fans, is this enough? They are a generally quite quietly admirable club who will finish 12th in the Premier League, the mid-tablist of the teams. They've got some really good players to watch. They can be on their day brilliant. They can on their day not be great. They get the occasional cup run. This is, potentially their second cup final in 10 years, that's not bad going for Crystal Palace at all. Lots of other teams would be more than happy with 2 cup final appearances in 10 years. They might win it, you never know. It's pretty even, the FA Cup this year. The idea that they might want to move on and have something else, what does that look like and how realistic is it? Because the chances are to move from 12th to 9th in the Premier League probably costs you
$500 million.
I don't know, 200 million, 100 million quid, 150 million quid, whatever.
Yeah.
To move from 9th to 6th probably costs you $250 million. And to move from 6th to 4th probably costs you another $250 million. Is that what Palace want? Is that even realistic? Because all the other teams that are ahead of them are spending as well. So to an extent, the hierarchy becomes calcified naturally. And I don't know whether... it's an awkward thing for Palace to work out. Because they're not on a journey. Brighton are still kind of on a journey. Isn't this amazing? 20 years ago, we were at the Withdean. Or Bournemouth, it's we've got a stadium full of 11,000 people. And look what we're doing. We could get into Europe for the first time. For Palace, I suppose Europe is maybe the one thing they've not had yet. But maybe this is it. Maybe this is what a team like Palace can be, at the risk of sounding like Miguel again, given the economics of modern football. Maybe there is no higher bar than just what they've done is the maximum Crystal Palace can ever be.
Well, what you've got there is you fall to that idea of, there's this idea, isn't it, that football fans suffer if they don't win trophies. And, the idea of Manchester City fans talks about it, Newcastle fans, we suffered for years without winning anything. No, you just supported a football team. Maybe Crystal Palace are the antidote to that, which is just like, we supported a football team, it was up and down, it was a good laugh sometimes, it was pretty bad other times. That's just what being a football fan is about, and you have to accept that. And if you are allegiance is to Crystal Palace, you sort of know what it's going to be. And this idea of, we've talked about this before, Rory, of success, it's sort of new. It's like but I want to be. But people didn't always want to be that. They just wanted to watch the football team, and they wanted them to be successful on their own terms. But this next step and progression, and this is Libero, the anti-growth podcast. I think we're starting to go that way, aren't we? So it's.
Do you think that if we accept that there are teams who are just don't have the financial firepower to compete with the big 6 or 7, which I think is realistic, I think those big 6 or 7 are not getting caught. And unless you are, and while I think there's probably a slightly separate category of the sort of Brentford and Brighton who maybe will try and, find a clever way around. And maybe Palace, if they did things differently, could be part of that. Although I do think Palace have recruited really well. Like they have bought, they have bought really good players, even though they don't have a reputation as being like a kind of, stats analysis club. Clearly, the players that Dougie Freedman has bought have been really good. Like Eze is a great buy, Wharton's a great buy, and so much so that people think they're academy players, but they're not. Like Gahey's the Chelsea academy player, has been a great buy. But do you think that kind of retaining that like regionality, for want of a better word, that we were talking about earlier, do you think that will be integral to the sort of happy, healthy continuance of a team who cannot challenge for trophies?
I think if you were looking at it from like a branding point of view, which is how PSG would look at it, then you'd say that being the place where Championship players go and prove they're good at the Premier League, that's a pretty good pitch. That's kind of where you want to be. It's a market niche. Yeah. It gives you a purpose. It gives you a thing that you do. And also, it works from a fan point of view. There's the other thing that John mentions. There's different ways of enjoying football, and one of them is going to watch a club that's got an amazing player. And if Palace are a team like that, they have historically been a team like that, where they have had the occasional amazing footballer who makes it all worthwhile. Like you appreciate them while they're there, and they're what takes you to the stadium. So as long as Palace obviously had Elise goes to Bayern Munich, Eze may go at some point, I'm not sure. It feels like the window might have closed a little bit on Eze.
Might be the Zaha situation.
Yeah, I think it's in the Zaha zone.
But that would be fine, because you're Eze, you are Crystal Palace. That's the star player of a small-ish team. There's nothing wrong with that status, I don't think. And Eze's a brilliant player in his day as well. That's the thing, isn't it?
And it's fine to have a team where what you do, to Selhurst Park every 2 weeks, you kind of put on your crampons and you embark on the Wednesday to try and get there for 3:00 on a Saturday, and you think, well, I'm going to get to see Eze, and maybe Eze will do something amazing. That's a legitimate reason to go to a football match.
Just to close up, Dougie Freedman, you mentioned there, he's departed the club, I believe, now. Gone to a Saudi Arabian club, which may, I suppose, and you might say that he might end up at another club with links to Saudi Arabia. We don't know that, but it's possible. So perhaps that is the end of the dream, as we do live in the era of the sporting director. But let's see what he's achieved. He's one of those people behind the scenes that you have to hail, don't you? And they're the type of people that we'd like to talk about on this podcast. Behind the news, let's call it that. But anyway, thanks very much to Jack and Rory, producer Tom, and of course, feel free to like us. Actually, don't feel free, do it anyway. Like us on Spotify, Apple,
YouTube,
wherever you get your podcasts.
Wherever you subscribe, all that stuff.
Smash that subscribe button.
Yeah. Make sure you smash it. That's the correct way to do it.
Smash it. Tell all your friends and your auntie too. And Yeah, and also email us, of course, at Libero podcast, one word, 0 @gmail.com. Thanks very much, and we'll see you again soon.